My name is Billy Larkin. I'm 35 years old, and at this exact moment, every phone around my grandmother's backyard is lighting up non-stop. One message changed the entire mood of the family gathering in seconds. My mother had just sent something into the family group chat. 48 relatives received it at the same time. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone. Attached to her message was a document showing a massive total, $347,000. The title of the message read, "The Price of Raising a Disappointment." Today was supposed to be Mother's Day. Instead, the entire backyard went silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations disappeared. One by one, every face slowly turned toward me. Some looked shocked. Others looked entertained. A few were clearly waiting for me to break down in front of everyone. But there was one thing nobody at that table knew. The woman claiming she sacrificed everything for me was not the person who actually raised me during the most important years of my childhood. For the first 7 years of my life, my grandmother carried that responsibility alone. So I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't cry. I simply unlocked my phone, opened the group chat, and posted a single photograph. That was it. Less than 24 hours later, almost every person in the family had cut contact with my mother completely. 47 relatives wanted nothing to do with her after seeing that image. The only person who didn't block her was my grandmother. And trust me, what Grandma Pearl decided to do next was far more painful. Before I continue, if stories like this interest you, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Now let's go back to how this all started. Mother's Day mornings in Savannah always arrive heavy with heat and humidity. By sunrise, the magnolia trees lining Abercorn Street were already blooming, filling the air with a thick sweet smell that clung to everything. I had been awake since before dawn. By 7 in the morning, I was loading my car with a 3-layer lemon pound cake along with containers of fresh strawberry compote packed carefully in coolers. Baking is my profession now. I own a bakery called Larkin's. What started as one tiny shop has grown into 2 busy locations and a catering business that keeps my schedule packed almost every week. But this was never part of my original plan. Years ago, I was studying to become a teacher at Georgia Southern University. I thought my future was already mapped out. Then everything changed after Grandma Pearl suffered her first stroke. Somebody needed to step in and help her. My mother never offered. The truth is, she had barely been part of my life growing up. She only returned when I was 7 years old, after marrying Gerald Vance and starting a brand new family with my younger half-sister, Brooke. From that point on, her attention stayed focused on them, not me. When Grandma Pearl became ill, Brooke was 13 and too young to help much. So I left school, moved back to Savannah, and spent the next year balancing hospital visits with late nights inside a rented commercial kitchen that cost me $400 a month. The bakery was born out of survival, not ambition. I baked because bills needed to be paid. I baked because medication wasn't cheap. I baked because keeping Grandma Pearl safe mattered more to me than finishing my degree. But none of those details ever mattered to the rest of my family. To them, I became the one who quit college. My mother, Marlene Vance, especially loved reminding people of that. Whenever relatives gathered together, she always introduced Brooke first with pride shining all over her face. "This is my youngest daughter Brooke," she'd say. "She's 27 and getting married this fall to a wonderful attorney." Then eventually she'd gesture toward me. "And this is Billy. She makes cakes." She said the word cakes like it was some childish hobby instead of a business. Never mind the fact that I had catered weddings with hundreds of guests. Never mind the 11 employees depending on my company for a paycheck. Never mind the reality that my bakery brought in more yearly revenue than her real estate office. In my mother's version of reality, I was still the college dropout playing with frosting. That afternoon, I drove down the gravel road leading to Grandma Pearl's cottage carrying the cake I'd spent all night finishing. What I didn't know then was that my mother already had that humiliating group message prepared weeks earlier. She had planned the entire thing in advance. Grandma Pearl's home sat near Thunderbolt, just outside Savannah. The little cottage had been standing there since the 1940s. A screened porch wrapped around most of the house, and an old ceiling fan clicked every few seconds like a clock struggling to keep time. Out front stood a massive magnolia tree so old it leaned sideways with age. That house was the only place in my life where I ever truly felt protected. Grandma Pearl answered the screen door before I even knocked. She was 81 years old, barely over 5 feet tall, yet somehow still carried herself with quiet strength. She hugged me tightly, smelling like sweet tea and lavender powder. "Let me see that cake, baby," she said with a smile. She studied it carefully, turning the stand slowly before nodding in approval. "You really outdid yourself this time." Then, unlike everyone else in the family, she asked serious questions about my work. She wanted details about the large catering contract I had landed with a hospitality company in Savannah. She asked about staffing numbers, profit margins, deadlines, and expansion plans. Grandma Pearl had worked as a bookkeeper for most of her life. She respected hard work and understood business better than anyone else in the family. Most importantly, she treated my career like it actually mattered. And honestly, that meant more to me than she probably ever realized. By the time I stepped fully inside Grandma Pearl's house, the place was already packed wall to wall with relatives. Aunt Dory was carefully lining up deviled eggs on a serving tray in the kitchen, while Uncle Wayne battled with the grill outside on the deck. Every corner of the house carried noise. Cousins laughing too loudly. Older relatives trading stories nobody under 30 cared about anymore. The usual Whitfield family chaos that showed up every Mother's Day without fail. Then I heard my mother's voice drifting from the kitchen. She wasn't whispering either. She wanted people to hear her. "I've handled everything by myself for years," she said dramatically. "Nobody ever helps me. Nobody." I stopped walking the second I heard it because even the walls knew that wasn't true. Behind me, Grandma Pearl quietly squeezed my hand beneath the dish towel she was carrying. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. That small gesture said everything. She knew exactly what my mother was doing. The problem with repeating a story long enough is that eventually people stop questioning it. Over time, even obvious fiction begins sounding believable. And my mother had been preparing this performance for weeks. Phone call after phone call. Small complaints dropped into conversations. Little emotional speeches aimed at relatives one at a time. "Billy barely visits anymore. She hasn't helped with Brooke's wedding. I sacrificed my entire life for my children. What did I ever get in return?" I could feel it immediately. The way people stared just a little too long. The forced smiles. The uncomfortable silence whenever I entered a conversation. Nobody said anything directly, but the tension was there hanging over the room like humidity before a thunderstorm. "So when are you finally giving the family free cakes for life?" he joked with a grin. A few people laughed harder than necessary. It was one of those comments disguised as humor but carrying a sharp edge underneath. Brooke stepped closer and lightly touched my arm. "Don't mind him, Billy. He's kidding." And honestly, Brooke usually meant well. She was 27, engaged to a successful corporate lawyer named Garrett, and had spent her entire life being the daughter who made everything easy for my mother. Good grades. No drama. Clear career path. Perfect engagement photos. Perfect future. She had no idea what it felt like to constantly be treated like the disappointing child standing next to the golden one. I carried my cake toward the long food table arranged across the back deck. The entire yard smelled like barbecue smoke, sweet tea, citronella candles, and summer heat. Pitchers of iced tea sweated onto the tablecloth. Gospel music floated softly from a portable speaker near the porch steps. Cicadas screamed from the oak trees surrounding the yard. The sound rolled across the backyard like a wave. My phone vibrated in my pocket. So did Aunt Dory's. Uncle Wayne checked his screen. The cousins sitting near the yard looked down at theirs too. 48 people. One notification. Whitfield Family Circle. The subject line contained only one word. Invoice. My mother slowly placed a tea glass down and smiled like somebody about to unveil a grand surprise. "Everyone check your phones," she said calmly. I opened the attachment. It looked professionally made. Tables, categories, polished formatting, bold lettering. She had clearly spent serious time creating it. At the top it read, Marlene Vance, Statement of Account. Underneath was my name followed by a detailed breakdown of supposed expenses connected to raising me. Prenatal costs and hospital delivery. Infant care expenses. Childhood support. School expenses. Sacrifices made on my behalf. Money supposedly wasted on my abandoned college future. Even emotional exhaustion was listed like a business expense. At the bottom sat the final total. $347,000. Then underneath, written in red letters, pay what you owe or finally admit what you became. A burden. I stared at the screen twice trying to process the absurdity of it all. The numbers were exaggerated beyond reason. Some were completely invented. Others made no sense at all. But facts didn't matter in that moment. The performance mattered. And my mother had delivered it perfectly. Around the table, relatives slowly scrolled through the document on their phones. Some shook their heads sadly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few looked at me with the kind of pity usually reserved for public embarrassment. Meanwhile, my mother sat there with perfect posture and a satisfied smile, looking completely confident in what she had done. Like she had just won an argument nobody else got to participate in. Then my eyes caught two sections again. Infant care, ages 0 to 3. Childhood expenses, ages 4 to 7. I felt my stomach tighten instantly. Those years didn't belong to her. She wasn't there. She hadn't changed those diapers. She hadn't stayed awake during fevers. She hadn't packed lunches or read bedtime stories or sat beside me through nightmares. Grandma Pearl did all of that. Yet my mother had claimed those years like they were hers to bill for. I slowly placed my phone face down on the table. Around me, the cicadas kept screaming in the trees. The old porch fan continued making its familiar clicking sound every few seconds. But the atmosphere had completely changed. The air felt heavier now. Tighter. Like the exact moment before a coastal storm crashes onto shore. My brain immediately started calculating outcomes the same way I calculate shortages in bakery inventory. If I stayed silent, everyone here would leave believing my mother's version of the story. I'd forever become the selfish daughter who took everything and gave nothing back. The irresponsible college dropout. The family embarrassment. Nobody would care that I left school to care for Grandma Pearl when nobody else stepped up. Nobody would remember the sacrifices I actually made. And worst of all, my 4-year-old daughter Lacey was asleep in her car seat outside waiting for Sam to bring her in after her nap. One day she could grow up hearing these same lies about her mother. But if I reacted emotionally, if I yelled, cried, or publicly accused Marlene of lying in front of everyone, then suddenly I'd become exactly what they expected me to be. The unstable one. The dramatic one. And my mother was counting on that. If I reacted the way my mother expected, she would win immediately. That was the entire strategy behind what she had done. She chose Mother's Day on purpose because most people automatically defend a mother on that kind of holiday. She sent the message in front of nearly 50 relatives because crowds create pressure, and pressure makes people pick sides quickly. And she had already been influencing those sides for weeks before anyone arrived at Grandma Pearl's house. Aunt Dory leaned slightly across the table and spoke softly. "Honey, do you want to say anything?" I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at my mother sitting confidently across the deck. Then finally I looked back down at the so-called invoice glowing on my phone screen. The section listing ages 0 through 7 stood out immediately. According to her document, she had spent tens of thousands of dollars raising me during years she barely existed in my life. And hidden somewhere inside my camera roll was proof that could destroy the entire story with one image. Under the table, I suddenly felt Grandma Pearl's hand wrap around mine again. Steady. Warm. Certain. It was the same hand that once guided me across this yard as a toddler. The same hand that packed my lunches, tied my shoes, and held me through fevers while my mother was nowhere to be found. Pearl knew exactly what those early years looked like because she lived every single day of them. She was the only one who did. I squeezed her hand back gently and made my decision. I wasn't going to stand there explaining my childhood to people who had already decided who the villain was. I wasn't going to beg relatives to believe stories about sleepless nights, cheap grocery runs, or Grandma Pearl teaching me how to read from labels on canned food because she couldn't afford proper children's books. Words give people room to doubt. Evidence doesn't. And I had evidence. One photograph. I knew exactly which one. It had been taken on this very porch more than 3 decades ago during another Mother's Day gathering. In the picture, I was 2 years old sitting on Pearl's hip while both of us squinted into the sunlight. Behind us stood the same magnolia tree, much smaller back then. What mattered most about the image, though, was who wasn't in it. My mother. She had already been gone for over a year when that photo was taken. But Pearl was there holding me the way real mothers hold children when nobody else steps up to do it. I finally spoke, keeping my voice calm enough that nobody could accuse me of causing a scene. Mom, this invoice says you raised me from birth. Marlene lifted her chin proudly. That's correct. Including ages 0 through 7? Every single day, she answered without hesitation. I nodded once. All right. I unlocked my phone slowly and opened the folder labeled Pearl. Before I could say another word, my mother jumped back in like she was controlling a courtroom. Well, Billy, everyone read it, she announced loudly to the yard. Her tone was polished and confident, almost rehearsed. I did, I replied. So did the other 48 people here. Good, she said. Then everybody can finally hear the truth. I looked directly at her. Which truth exactly, Mom? Her smile tightened slightly. The truth that I raised you. The truth that I sacrificed for you and received nothing back. From birth. I asked again carefully. You're absolutely sure about that? For the first time all afternoon, a crack appeared. Tiny, but visible. Her smile stayed in place, but her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. Near the grill, Uncle Wayne slowly cleared his throat. He hadn't spoken much all day, but now he tilted his head thoughtfully like something wasn't fitting together anymore. My mother noticed immediately. Wayne, you remember, she said quickly. I was always there. Wayne scratched his jaw before answering. Marlene. I remember Pearl having that child most of the time. Temporarily, my mother snapped back. While I was working. Wayne frowned slightly. Working where? The entire deck fell silent. Even the birds in the magnolia tree seemed louder suddenly. The old ceiling fan kept clicking overhead while my mother straightened her posture defensively. I don't need to explain myself to anybody, she said sharply. Then she turned toward the rest of the family. I raised both my daughters. I'm the one who sacrificed so they could have opportunities. Aunt Dory slowly lowered her fork onto her plate. Marlene, she said carefully. She's asking a fair question. Where exactly were you during those first years? My mother's jaw tightened instantly. I was rebuilding my life, she answered. That's what mothers do. And who was raising Billy while you rebuilt it? Wayne asked quietly. That was the moment Grandma Pearl gently placed her fork down beside her plate. I could feel the energy around the table changing completely now. 5 minutes earlier, relatives had been nodding along with my mother's speech. Now people were exchanging uncertain glances while mentally comparing timelines. The numbers in the invoice were no longer making sense. I kept my tone respectful and measured. Mom, your invoice says you spent $22,000 on infant care. That's right. And $38,000 during ages 4 through 7. I raised you, Billy. I looked directly at her. What address did we live at when I was 3 years old? Silence. For the first time that day, she hesitated. We moved around, she said eventually. I shook my head calmly. No, we didn't. I lived here with Grandma Pearl. That was temporary, she replied quickly. I already explained that. 3 years is temporary. Now her voice began rising slightly, and I recognized the tone immediately. It was the same strained voice she used whenever one of her real estate deals started falling apart, and she needed people to stop asking detailed questions. I was building a future for you, she insisted. Around the yard, relatives were rereading the invoice again, but this time they weren't admiring it. They were examining it. Tanner slowly lowered his phone. Aunt Dory pressed her lips together tightly. Nobody looked quite as confident anymore. And I still hadn't shown them the photograph. Not yet. I wanted to see how long my mother would keep pushing the story. Then Marlene did what she always did whenever she felt control slipping away from her. She stood up dramatically. Her chair scraped loudly against the deck as she planted both hands firmly on the table and addressed the family like a public speaker trying to win back a crowd. Let me make something clear, she declared loudly. I carried that child for 9 months. I gave birth to her, my mother said loudly, her voice carrying across the backyard. I came back for her. I enrolled her in school. I drove her everywhere. Activities, appointments, school events, everything. I kept my tone calm. You enrolled me in 3rd grade, I replied. The backyard instantly went quiet again. I was 8 years old. That silence hit harder than any shouting could have. Because everyone sitting at those tables understood exactly what that meant. 3rd grade comes after kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. Somebody else had handled those years. And suddenly people started doing the timeline in their heads. My mother's expression tightened immediately. You're twisting things, she snapped. I'm not twisting anything, I answered. I'm naming a grade level. Across the table, Brooke slowly turned toward our mother with a look I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Confusion. Mom, Brooke said carefully, you always told me you raised Billy by yourself from the beginning. I did, Marlene replied quickly. Brooke frowned slightly. Then who signed her up for kindergarten? My mother looked at her sharply. Sweetheart, this doesn't concern you. It's a simple question, Brooke said quietly. The air around the backyard felt tighter by the second. The long table covered with casseroles, cornbread, sweet tea, and the lemon cake I had spent hours baking suddenly felt less like a family dinner and more like a courtroom. Then Grandma Pearl stood up. Not quickly. At 81, she moved carefully now. Her knees no longer allowed sudden movements. But when Pearl Whitfield rose from her chair, people paid attention automatically. Without saying a word, she walked through the screen door into the house. The old spring door creaked loudly behind her before slamming shut. Nobody spoke while she was gone. About 30 seconds later, she returned carrying an old shoebox held together with a thick rubber band. The corners were bent from age, and the cardboard looked worn soft after decades in storage. She placed it gently in the middle of the table beside the pitcher of sweet tea and the tray of deviled eggs. Nobody touched it. Nobody even breathed near it. The box sat there quietly like a witness waiting to testify. Every eye at the table locked onto it instantly. Pearl rested one hand on the back of her chair and finally spoke. This box, she said calmly, has been sitting in my closet for over 30 years. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough authority that nobody interrupted. Inside are photographs, letters, school forms, medical receipts, and every record I kept from the day Billy was born until the day Marlene came back for her. My mother's face lost color immediately beneath her makeup. Mom, don't. Hush. Pearl didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. When Grandma Pearl said, hush, it never sounded like a request. It sounded final. Like a judge ending an argument. The entire table froze. I kept these records because I was a bookkeeper for 40 years, Pearl continued. Keeping records is what I do. Then she looked directly at me. Billy, do you want me to open it? I shook my head slowly. Not yet, Grandma. Let me handle this first. She nodded once and sat back down, but the shoebox remained exactly where she placed it. Right in the center of the table. Like evidence waiting for the right moment. I watched my mother stare at it without blinking. She knew what was inside. She had to know. Most of those records had been created while she was absent, and Grandma Pearl had documented every single year carefully. And records kept by someone who spent decades balancing financial ledgers don't suddenly become emotional or exaggerated. They don't invent numbers. They don't inflate stories. They don't add imaginary charges for emotional effort. They simply exist. Quiet, precise, patient, waiting for somebody to need the truth. Next to my mother, Brooke leaned closer and whispered something under her breath. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone immediately. For the first time in her life, Brooke sounded like she was questioning our mother instead of agreeing with her. And my mother heard it too. The shoebox hadn't even been opened yet, but the atmosphere around the entire gathering had already shifted. I glanced back down at my phone screen. The family group chat was exploding now. Relatives who weren't even at the cookout had started responding. Cousins from Atlanta. An aunt living in Jacksonville. Older relatives from Macon. Question marks filled the conversation. What exactly is going on? Marlene, this seems extreme. Why send something like this on Mother's Day? My mother had wanted an audience when she sent that invoice. She wanted pressure. She wanted the weight of the Whitfield family pushing down on me until I apologized for things I never did. But she forgot something important about group conversations. Once you open the door, everyone gets a voice. And not everyone follows the same direction. I quietly looked around the backyard again, taking mental inventory. At least a dozen relatives there were old enough to remember those early years clearly. Uncle Wayne remembered. Aunt Dory remembered pieces of it. Pearl's older brother Gerald, living in Macon, definitely remembered. These people weren't strangers hearing a random story online. They had physically visited this same house decades ago. They had seen me sitting on Pearl's hip while my mother was nowhere around. They just never talked about it openly. Because families rarely discuss the things that matter most. Instead, they avoid them. They talk about recipes, football scores, folding chairs, weather, weddings, and church gossip while the real stories stay buried underneath everything else. My mother confused silence with support. She was wrong. Silence usually just means nobody has decided to speak yet. Until somebody finally does. Brooke looked down at her phone again. Mom, she said quietly, people in the chat are asking questions now. Let them ask, Marlene replied. But this time her confidence cracked slightly. Just enough for me to hear it. Marlene stood up once again and tapped a spoon lightly against a glass, a move she used often at church gatherings whenever she wanted complete control of a room. The sound cut through the backyard instantly. I want everyone here, she announced, and everyone reading the family chat, to hear this clearly. The entire porch fell silent. Even the constant noise of the cicadas seemed quieter for a moment. My daughter Billy had every opportunity one could possibly give her, Marlene continued dramatically. I paid for her birth. I paid for her childhood. I helped with college before she walked away from it all. She paused long enough to let the words settle over the crowd. And what have I received in return? Nothing. No appreciation. No support. Most holidays she barely even visits. Another carefully timed pause. Today on Mother's Day, I'm asking her in front of this entire family to finally make things right. Or admit the truth about herself. Across the table, Tanner had already lifted his phone and started recording. 2 more cousins quietly followed his lead. My mother pointed directly at me. Billy, stand up. I stayed seated. Say it, she demanded. Say thank you for everything I sacrificed for you. I looked at her steadily. No. The word landed heavily across the porch. Simple. Quiet. Final. Marlene blinked once. Excuse me. No, I repeated calmly. Because the invoice is false, and you know it. She turned toward the family immediately like an attorney redirecting a courtroom. See this, she said loudly. 35 years of motherhood and she can't even say thank you. Then she shook her head dramatically. This is what I've dealt with my entire life. A daughter who quit school, opened a small bakery, and acts like she's owed something by the world. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others still nodded along because my mother had spent weeks feeding them her version of events. From farther down the table, one of Marlene's cousins spoke up carefully. Billy, it's Mother's Day. Maybe just tell her you appreciate her. I do appreciate someone, I answered. Marlene's smile stiffened. The person who actually raised me. The expression on her face cracked instantly. I raised you, she snapped. I kept my voice level and controlled. Mom, you sent a $347,000 bill to 48 relatives and publicly called me a burden on Mother's Day. In front of Grandma Pearl. In front of the woman who actually... Don't you dare. Her voice broke sharply for the first time. Not from sadness. From losing control. Don't you dare sit there pretending I wasn't your mother. I'm not pretending anything, I replied. I'm asking you to tell the truth about the timeline. I was there, she shouted. The words echoed across the yard. At the far end of the table, a young child started crying from the sudden tension. Brooke quickly placed a hand on our mother's arm. Mom, please sit down. Marlene shook her off immediately. Her eyes had started watering now, and for a brief second, beneath all the manipulation and performance, I saw something painfully human underneath. Fear. Desperation. Because she needed this version of the story to survive. If the story collapsed, then the identity she built around it collapsed too. I could have destroyed her completely right there. I could have listed every year she missed. Every address where Grandma Pearl raised me while Marlene built a new life in another state. I could have explained how I had quietly paid for Pearl's roof repairs, medical treatments, physical therapy, and house expenses for years because I was taking care of the woman who once took care of me. But winning a moment like this isn't about talking louder. You don't defeat someone who has rehearsed a story for 30 years by arguing with them. You defeat them with proof they cannot explain away. I looked directly at my mother. Mom, I said quietly, you charged me for ages 0 through 7. I raised you. Then you'll recognize what I'm about to show everyone. I unlocked my phone again and opened the photograph. It was an old Polaroid that had been digitally scanned years earlier. The colors had faded into soft amber tones, and the edges were slightly overexposed from age. But the image was still clear enough. A woman stood on this exact porch holding a small child on her hip. The same porch screens. The same magnolia tree. The same uneven floorboards beneath her feet. The woman wore a flowered apron. The baby wore a yellow outfit. The woman was Pearl. The baby was me. And written carefully across the white bottom border in Pearl's handwriting were the words. Mother's Day, May 9th, 1993. There was one more thing impossible to ignore. My mother wasn't anywhere in the frame. Not on the porch. Not inside the house. Not anywhere in my life that year. I looked down at the family group chat still open on my screen and typed a single sentence beneath the image. Happy Mother's Day to the woman who truly raised me. For 1 second, my thumb hovered above the send button. And I need people to understand something clearly. I didn't arrive at that cookout planning revenge. I didn't walk into Grandma Pearl's yard preparing for a public confrontation. I came carrying a cake. I came because Pearl invited me. I came because even after everything, I still answered when family called. But my mother brought an invoice. She publicly humiliated me in front of nearly 50 relatives and demanded gratitude for years she never lived through beside me. And the only thing I had against the version of history she spent decades building was one photograph showing who actually held me when I was little. So I pressed send. At exactly 5:47 p.m. on Mother's Day, every phone across that porch buzzed simultaneously. Then more phones buzzed across Georgia, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Macon, Augusta. Dozens of relatives stared down at the same image at the exact same moment. People looked at their screens. Then at Marlene. Then at Pearl. Grandma Pearl sat calmly with her hands folded in front of her, saying absolutely nothing while whispers spread through the yard like wind moving through tall grass. Tanner slowly lowered his camera. Aunt Dory covered her mouth. Uncle Wayne closed his eyes and shook his head slowly like a man finally watching a suspicion become reality after carrying it quietly for decades. I know, Uncle Wayne continued quietly, because my neighbor listed a property with your office and backed out. Your sales haven't looked good in months. The atmosphere in the yard shifted instantly. Not louder. Worse. People had stopped reacting emotionally and started understanding what this was really about. I could see the realization spreading across the table one face at a time. My mother didn't send that invoice because she truly believed I owed her hundreds of thousands of dollars. She sent it because she needed money. The daughter she publicly called a burden was supposed to write a check large enough to rescue the wedding expenses she could no longer manage. Brooke stared at our mother like someone realizing the map they trusted had been wrong the entire trip. You told me Billy was selfish, Brooke said softly. Marlene crossed her arms tightly. She is. You told me she never helped anybody. She doesn't. Brooke shook her head slowly. She paid for Grandma's roof repair. Silence. And her physical therapy after the stroke, Brooke continued. Grandma told me last Christmas. My mother looked away. And suddenly everything connected. The fake invoice. The public humiliation. The timing before Brooke's expensive wedding. It had never been about family history. It was about money. I slowly stood up from my chair. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just calmly, the way someone stands when dinner is finished and there's nothing left to say. I didn't send that photograph to embarrass you, Mom. She still refused to look at me. I sent it because I'm tired of being described as something I'm not. I took a breath. I'm not your disappointment. I'm not some unpaid debt hanging over your life. The yard stayed completely silent. I left college because Grandma Pearl needed help and nobody else stepped forward. As I spoke, my eyes drifted toward the living room through the screen door. Lacey was asleep on a blanket with her thumb tucked in her mouth while Sam sat quietly nearby watching over her, completely unaware that the family around her was coming apart only a few feet away. I looked back at my mother. And don't ever call me a burden in front of my daughter again. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't repeat myself. I only said it once. But I meant it permanently. Then I sat back down beside Grandma Pearl and gently rested my hand on her arm. Thank you, I told her quietly. For everything you did for me. And everything you still do. Pearl patted my hand once. Her eyes had gone glossy with emotion, but her posture stayed firm and steady. She gave the smallest nod, the same one she used whenever numbers balanced correctly in one of her old accounting books. Across the table, my mother kept staring at the shoebox. She knew exactly what else sat inside it. She always had. Finally, she stood up abruptly. This conversation is over, she announced. That's your decision, I answered calmly. She grabbed her purse from the back of the chair. Brooke, let's go. Brooke didn't move. Marlene's expression hardened. Brooke. I'm staying, Brooke replied quietly. My mother blinked in disbelief. Excuse me. I said I'm staying. I want to talk to Grandma. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Marlene turned and walked off the porch alone. Her heels clicked sharply against the gravel driveway while everyone watched in silence. A few seconds later, her car engine started. Then she was gone. The magnolia leaves barely moved in the humid evening air. Glasses of sweet tea sat untouched on the table while nobody seemed sure what to say next. That night I couldn't sleep. After Sam put Lacey to bed, he sat beside me on the couch without trying to force conversation. That's who he is. He understands when silence helps more than advice.